was then, okay, good. They just told me recording in progress. So there you go. She had told me at the time that she really wanted to work, but she really did have a hard time. She had a hard time sort of connecting with folks. Let me do a little bit of a quiz and just do me a favor. If you go throw it in the chat if you want to, or you can say it out loud. What is, in your experience, what's the predictor of work outcomes, vocational outcomes in people with severe and persistent mental illnesses? Anybody know? There's a real answer. There's like a what's the literature say, what's everybody think answer, and then there's the answer that I would suggest to you. Most people are going to tell you, by the way, if you ever get this on a test, on CRC or any test like that, the right answer is job history. That's the right answer.
Oh.
I'll tell you what the real answer is, in my experience, it's reciprocal social skills. If Jennifer can look at me, and I'm sorry, Jennifer, I'm picking on you, but I can see you. If Jennifer can look at me and say, oh, Mike has this strength and I have this strength, and we got to work on a project together. We got to get this done today. We got to get this work thing done. Mike's pretty organized and I'm a big picture person, right? We can collaborate on that. I can see Jennifer's strengths. I can collaborate with Jennifer. That's reciprocal social skills, the ability to connect socially and collaborate socially. As a wise philosopher once said, stop, collaborate, and listen. If you get that reference, you're old enough, right? Um, so reciprocal social skills are the real answer. Why am I so confident in putting that out there? Is there a study that shows that? There's a number of studies that allude to that. None reach that conclusion directly, but I'll tell you this. We fall back on this idea in science, don't we, of falsifiability. It's only good science if it's falsifiable. So, okay, so if one can exist without the other, and if one can exist without the other, then we can get a sense of what might be true. So let's do the math. Here's what I'll tell you. If somebody has a great job history, but they're really struggling with that reciprocal social skill part, they're probably going to lose that job, right? You can have the best job history in the world, and if you can't do the reciprocal social skill part, you're going to struggle with keeping jobs. The flip side is not true. If you've got reciprocal social skills and no job history, you can work and you can work successfully. So it's something to think about. You know, community, the ability to connect with other people is central. It's critical. That's why there's a researcher out there. If you're a research geek like me, and you want to know if you want to study schizophrenia and work outcomes, the researcher you got to pay attention to is a guy named Sang, Tsang. He's been doing research for the last 30 years. Started in about the late 90s, and he's still at it. And he has studied work outcomes among people with schizophrenia for many, many years. And the first thing he found was the quicker we can get them to work, the better. The slower, the worse. The other thing he found was social skills mattered, really mattered. So when you put rapid employment into place, when you put those sorts of things into place, work outcomes got better. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when you added social skill development to that process, it got a little bit better still. And when you added cognitive interventions, right? Because schizophrenia specifically doesn't come with an IQ impairment, but it comes with some cognition impairment. If you can add those, so adding what's in the vocational world we would think of as IPS, right?
Okay,
The
Jim, I'm
individual,
leaving.
sorry. Oh, okay. So in the vocational world, if you think about individual placement and supports, Sang has found that that's wildly successful. We'll talk about that and what that is in a little bit. Sang also found when you added a social aspect to that, social skill development, it got better. And when you added social and cognitive, it got even better. So we'll talk about why that might be as we go along. But when we deprive people of those opportunities to grow, we deprive them of some potential. And so I'm going to go back to the story now. This person had a lot of trouble with jobs, and really there was the reciprocal social skills that she was struggling most with. But the one thing that was clear is she was in a sheltered workshop at the time, and she was having a real tough time. And the agency, and understandably so, they were saying, well, boy, she's lost a couple of jobs. We don't want to burn too many bridges. Let's put her in the workshop and let her learn some skills that she can translate into the workspace. Well, here's the problem with severe and persistent mental illnesses. There are two neuropsychological processes that suffer. Those are generalization and executive function. Executive function means adaptive behavior, right? So when my behavior is not working, I've got to change the pattern. When severe and persistent mental illnesses are present, that ability tends to fade. The other one is generalization. So it's the Amy's ability, sorry, Amy's ability to learn one thing in this seminar and then go use it out there somewhere else in the real world. That's called generalization. That ability also fades in severe and persistent mental illness. So why in the world, and I had read this article right around this time, why in the world would we take this girl and put her in a sheltered workshop and expect her to learn some things, change her behavior, and put it into placement in the next job? It's not going to happen. That's not how this person's going to learn. In fact, what we've learned is people with severe and persistent mental illnesses learn better in the actual work environment. They learn better on the job. Train in place versus place and train. Train in place, traditional vocational rehabilitation services do not tend to be effective with people with severe and persistent mental illnesses because of those two neuropsychological erosions that we see. So, why would we continue to do the same thing and expect different results? So I went to my supervisor and I said, I got an idea. I want to put her into a job. And she said, well, she's lost a lot of jobs. I said, I know. And she's probably going to lose a couple more, but let's do it. And here's why. Here's what the data suggests. Here's why we should do this. By the way, this is back in 2004. So this was a newish idea. I mean, and I will say that South Carolina was one of the first to jump on board with the IPS program, one of the first to join the learning community, one of the first to put it into place as an evidence-based practice. So I give the state a lot of credit for that, but it certainly wasn't widespread. It wasn't ubiquitous, wasn't around. The ideas weren't out there. So we got this person a job. Guess how long? Just throw it out there. Just say it. Unmute your mic and say it. Guess how long until she lost that job? Anybody know?
She kept it.
She did not. It was 1 hour. She got fired in an hour. So, okay, she came back and I said to my supervisor, I want to do it again. Because I think this is a good opportunity to process like in the space that she wanted to be in, she wasn't successful. So let's process that a little bit. And we did. We processed why it happened, how it happened, concentration on the thought process, the social skills, got her the next job. Take a guess, and Holly, you were kind enough to do this the first time. Take a guess as to how long she stayed in the second job.
2 hours.
2 hours. You're close. 2 weeks. She got fired in 2 weeks. Third job. How long in the third job?
A month.
3 months. 3 months. At which point, there were people concerned at another agency that came in and said, we're concerned that this person is being put in terrible positions. And I said, great, I'm glad you're here. Have a seat. And I wrote a little bar chart, an hour, 2 days, 3 months, and said, this is growth. This is progress. This person's been in a sheltered workshop, has seen no growth, no progress for years. All of a sudden, in the course of about 6 months or so, we've seen this progress. And they said, you know what? That's progress. That's growth. They could see that. In her fourth job, how long was she in her fourth job? Take a guess. By the way, this was 2004.
4 years.
She has been there 21 years and counting.
Oh, fourth time is the charm. Oh,
So
cool.
four was the charm. And I think what the charm was, and I don't take any credit for this at all. This wasn't me. She did that work. She was the one that really took it into account. But she was doing it in the competitive environment. She was doing it in the real world, and she was existing in the real world. And that was the laboratory in which she best learned. So if we would have deprived her of those opportunities to fail those 3 times, we would have deprived her of the ability to be in this job for this long. So, all right, let's do some shifts here. The challenges posed by psych disabilities, not qualitatively different or distinct from, the rest of the population. So what works for the rest of the population could theoretically work for the psychiatric rehab population. That's a meaningful shift as well. And we'll talk about what that means. And again, I've posted anytime I say something and say, here's what the data says, I've given you a citation for it. I'm also more than happy. I've got a reading list for you that I can send to you. The references got so small you need a magnifying glass to see them. I've got much of those in there as well. So if you ever want to get to the bottom of where does that live, where does that exist, what is that study, what is that data, just let me know and I'm happy to share with you. So here's the goal. We're going to probably, hopefully, improve our understanding of psych rehab assessment. We're going to look at that first because first you got to assess, you've got to look, and you've got to help the client to assess. That's something that's a big shift. Much of the older process might be the professional assessing the environment, the professional assessing function, the professional assessing skills. And that's only a little bit important. What's your guess as to how long the average person with a severe and persistent mental illness ends up connected with professionals? How much of their life do they spend with professionals? Corey, what's your guess? I can see you now because you were kind enough to speak. Oh, Corey just ducked out. He's like, oh, no, I don't want to know.
Yeah, I'm sorry, there's muting and unmuting. My fine motor skills access to my keyboard is impeded by cat disorder.
Fair
Um,
enough.
let's see. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering how much of a person with a severe and persistent mental illness's life by
Oh,
percentage is spent with a professional.
I'm gonna go with at least 45%, high percentage.
Yeah, that's it's less than that. It's about 20%.
Okay.
The person without a severe and persistent mental illness, it's less than 3%. But so
Uh,
what's that mean in terms of the other side of that stat? That means that the vast majority of their life is going to be spent without us around. So we've got to help them to begin to assess. We've got to help them to begin to investigate the environment. We got to help them to begin to improve their understanding of the role of work in their own recovery. We got to help them to understand the principles that can be applied to moving forward with them. So how do you do that? How do you work more effectively in an assessment? You got to collaborate with that person. Again, as Corey pointed out to us, most of this person's life they're going to spend without us. So when we start looking at assessment and how things are going, the more we involve the client, the more the buy-in increases. It garners support and it strengthens support systems. So if that person has a horse in the race, they're going to be more likely to stick with it. Well, how do we know that? We know that from self-determination theory. So if, for example, in self-determination theory, I've got a reference for it if you want to read more about it. Ryan and DC are the names to read. Ryan, just like it sounds, DECI. Their seminal study was published in the late 90s, and they did a real good one in 2000. And basically, what they found was, in reviewing all of the behavioral health literature, that internally driven change is more time stable than externally driven change. If I said to Corey, listen, dude, I think I'll give you $5 if you dress in a suit tomorrow. Corey might be like, okay, $5 is $5. I'll put a suit on for you. So Corey, let's just do a little bit of math here. Let's say you do that for 100 days straight. I'm paying you $5 a day. How much of my money do you have now?
$5 a day, for a month straight.
Five times 100.
Five times 100. Okay, 500.
500,
500.
right. So you got 500. You got five C
Mm-hmm.
notes in your pocket. If I
Mm-hmm.
come to you that next day so you have $500 in your pocket now.
Mm-hmm.
Is my $5 worth more or less to you now than it was the first time?
Hmm. Less because I already have $500.
Less. A hundred
Right.
percent, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's another $5. I already got 500.
Mm-hmm.
External rewards decrease in value over time.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say, on the other hand, that I know Corey is, and I don't know Corey, but I'm just guessing. Corey's a driven kind of guy, and he's interested in getting to where he wants to be. And let's say one of his values is, you know what? I want to present to the world what I want in life, and I think wearing a suit is where it's at. I love doing that. That's how I express myself.
Hmm.
You are far more likely, Corey, to engage in that behavior with that internally driven value than you are with
Mm,
an externally rewarded value. Does that make sense?
makes total sense. Because the
So
novelty of the reward keeps going down too, as well as the value.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So the
Mm.
novelty goes down, the value goes down, the value to you goes down over time. If it's an internally driven value, it's an internally held value, that's more time stable, person's more likely to stick to it. And so when we assess and we collaborate with the person, what we're doing is we're facilitating their own ability to examine their environment, examine opportunities for moving forward, and connect it with their own internal values. It enhances outcomes fundamentally. Shared decision making, same idea here. And you'll see the Thomas study referenced over and over again. It's in the reference list. Um, that took a look, it was a systemic review, a meta analysis, if you will, of a lot of the literature around working with people with severe and persistent mental illnesses and recovery. And Thomas sort of pointed out the things that seem to work. And shared decision making is one of the critical features that drives a lot of good recovery services. You get greater buy-in, greater satisfaction, certainly better outcomes. That Drake reference that you see there has to do with work outcomes. The Simpian and Tory reference also has to do with work outcomes. Um, the Muser outcomes data, in order to be successful, consumers need more information about options. That's a really important thing. If we're the repository of all the knowledge, right? If we're the professionals and we've got all the resource knowledge and the what works knowledge, how does that help Corey in the other 80% of Corey's life when he's going to spend without us? It doesn't, right? So folks need resources. Any human being needs the information. So shared decision making and collaboration helps us to connect Corey with the information he needs, Mike with the information he needs, Chris with the information she needs, Jen with the information she needs. So it's really important to know that shared decision making is more than just a kind of a nice to have, it's a critical feature. Person-centered goal identification. There, we just talked about this. People are more likely to move towards vocational and treatment outcomes of their own definition and development. Talk about self-determination theory. Fundamentally, that's true. I'll tell you a story. I know you're shocked. I got to pick up the pace here. But anyway, I had a client wanted to be a singer. A lot of other people told her that wasn't realistic. Um, what I said to her was, I think that's fantastic. Let's decide what you need to do to get there. Um, she had dropped out of every single vocational plan that she had ever been a part of because it was like, we're going to get you a job at Burger King, and then you'll work for 90 days. We'll close your case. And she was not interested in working at Burger King. So we looked into what she needed, and she said, well, I need to make a demo, and she needed money to make the demo. And I said, okay, so there's lots of different job options that you can do, but like I want you to be able to be working towards something you really want. She said, well, how about a job at Burger King so I can make the money? I said, well, okay. So so we got her a job at Burger King. She made just enough money to cut her demo. She cut her demo. She then worked at Burger King, and then she worked at a Pepsi plant. She worked at a couple different places. She ended up selling her demo. She moved to LA, and she's a singer in LA right now. Um,
Oh,
the difference between that and a traditional vocational outcome is the traditional vocational approach is let's get you working right now, let's get you, and that becomes the goal. So one of the questions you want to ask yourself is, am I talking to this person about a job, or am I talking to this person about a career? How engaged is this person going to be? Okay, I need to pick up the pace dramatically here. So here's some different ways that we can assess. And again, you'll have this PowerPoint. You can look at it anytime you like. Self-report questionnaires, they're efficient. They can be used in groups. They're great. They can lead to increased disclosure. Their disadvantages is people got to be able to read. That's an issue for some folks. In some areas of functioning difficult to rate, people don't understand what the question's asking, and they can be less accurate. Informant-based assessments, right? When we get somebody that knows that person real well, maybe more accurate, independent perspective, social context may be more present. That's real important because that person might know, hey, this is the context behind that. This is the reasons behind X, Y, and Z happening. May be tough time finding somebody who's really reliable, and consumers may not be willing to identify an informant depending on, again, their social connectedness. Um, I can't say enough about situational assessments. They are time consuming, but I'm here to tell you they're about the best thing there is for assessing different things. So if I can put Jen into a situation where she's in the real world where she's employing social skills, then we can both get a sense of what that's like. Is she good at it? Is she not good at it? What does she need to work on? What is her perception of that? We can engage in collaboration and shared decision making around that. She can assess it while we're assessing it. It's excellent for assessing work skills. And I'm a big believer in using the competitive work environment for that. That'll give you the most accurate information. It's by far the most detailed assessment method available. It's also the most experiential for the client. So again, good assessment works. The goal of assessment is to help the client learn more about themselves, not for us to learn more about the client. That's a big shift. That's a recovery-based shift that we're making now, but it's sometimes hard for us. And I'll talk about why. So let's talk a little bit about work as the therapeutic role, work as a life task. We get the vast majority of our information from either the workspaces that we're required to be in or the social spaces we're required to be in. Most of us spend a lot of our time working. I know that if I don't show up for this ARCA seminar, Chris is going to have me for lunch, right? And if I show up not groomed and I don't, I'm not really focused and those sorts of things, I'm going to get some feedback about that. So a lot of the feedback we get about ourselves comes from the feedback we get in the form of work and feedback and those sorts of things. I have to focus. I'm expected to be there. Um, there's an appropriate challenge in it for me. Our brains don't do well without appropriate challenge. We, for many years, told people with severe and persistent mental illnesses, listen, don't get too stressed out. You'll be back in the hospital. Take this time, kind of sit on the sidelines. Don't get too stressed. But our brains aren't built for that. There's a reason that we've used solitary confinement as punishment since the beginning of human being time. And that is, we're not made to be isolated. We're not made to do nothing. We're not made to sort of separate ourselves and not do things. Our brains work better when they're engaged. So if we can put an appropriate challenge in front of someone and it's appropriate challenge that they're interested in engaging in, people do better. Their symptoms get better. I had a client had really significant interconnectedness problems, had a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, had a really difficult time managing emotion, heard voices, had some psychotic features. Got her a job. She was 17, got her a job at a local military base. She was working as a food service person, and she totally got into the social environment. So I went to do a job visit. And I get there and I wave to her and she waves. And I kind of go behind the line and I said, hey, how's it going? How you doing? She's like, I'm busy. Like, okay, all right. So I go back and she takes a break and she's like, look, I've got a 15-minute break, but I've got to talk to this other girl about, what's going on with this and what's going on with that. And I said, all right, cool. But how's it going like with symptoms at work? How you feeling? Like, that's my job, right? I'm doing a vocational assessment. She's like, Mike, I don't have time to think about that. I got to work.
Ah,
That's the power of appropriate challenge. That's the power of engagement. And I'm here to tell you that when people get engaged in something in front of them, they tend to figure out how to manage symptoms, even when those symptoms are present. So those positive symptoms aren't necessarily what's going to predict those vocational outcomes. What's going to predict those are the negative symptoms. What's going to predict those are the social connectedness parts. What's going to predict those are the level of engagement. Talk about what works in employment. Traditional voc rehab services not effective. We talked about that. Train in place versus place and train. Place and train works a little bit better. IPS works. I've got an extended section on IPS here. If you want to learn more, supported employment tends to work. IPS is individual placement and supports. It's an evidence-based best practice identified by Sampson many years ago. And the idea is, and we'll talk through what the principles of that are, and we'll talk about why that works here in a second. There's a myth of ready to work out there in the vocational landscape. We've got to and if we applied that myth to that person who went a couple hours, a couple weeks, a couple months, and we applied that myth to her, she never would have left that environment, right? So the ready to work myth tends to be a myth. People learn better when there's zero barriers to getting in. Let's take a look at it. IPS focuses on competitive employment. Remember, I talked about not sheltered workshops, those sorts of things. Competitive environments tend to be the better place. Zero exclusion, eligibility follows client choice. So when Corey says, I want to work, sorry, Corey, I can see you now. When Corey says, I want to work, he works, right? It follows client choice, not necessarily our perception of whether Corey is ready to work. Attention to client preferences. We do what Corey wants to do. Rapid job search. This is gonna go quickly, and we're gonna move towards. We know that getting somebody to work quickly is more important than maybe spending 7 months trying to find exactly the right thing. Targeted job development based on Corey's interest, based on Mike's interest, based on Chris's interest. Integration of employment services with mental health treatment. Services work better when they're integrated. That gets tricky. If you're in a state where those services are siloed, sometimes you have to work within that system. And then we, as rehabilitation counselors, sometimes become the nexus of that care. Personalized benefits counseling, people got to realize, okay, I might be getting a benefit. How's that? How's working going to influence that? What's the upside? What's the upside potential? How do I make good decisions about that? And individualized long-term support, also a critical feature. What we know also works is supported employment. I am not going to go through all the supported employment stuff, but you're going to see, you're going to hear, you're going to look real familiar. Zero exclusion, integration of vocational and mental health services, benefits counseling, client preferences, rapid job search. Following, you getting the idea here? Is the recovery oriented services tend to follow the same principles. Those are basic recovery principles. We'll talk a little bit about stigma, social stigma, family stigma, self-stigma. Um, there's considerable social stigma around mental health services. We build even a counseling office. If you've been in a therapy office at any time in the last, maybe you have a counselor, a psychiatrist that you see. Everybody can benefit from a counselor. You don't need to have something wrong with you to go to a counselor. But don't we build back doors that you can sneak out of so you don't have to go into the waiting room? We do. We build offices that way. We contribute as professionals to the level of stigma. And I don't know what the right answer to that is. I get privacy. I mean, I don't have a problem with that necessarily. But I think we have to do a better job as a field of thinking about destigmatizing our own services. Family stigma. There's a lot of stigma around mental illness with families. And to some degree, it's very understandable. It's very difficult to watch somebody close to you struggle and go into the hospital. And families just want that person to be safe and stable. And so they will tend to advocate for interventions that keep somebody safe and stable, as opposed to put somebody into situations where they might be growing or they might be, there might be a little bit more high stakes. So, and families do that because they love that person. That's not a terrible thing, but sometimes we have to work with families through the stigma part. The self stigma, I'm not sure if I can do this. People do better when they're deeply engaged. They also do better when they're ready, when they're confident. That's where motivational interviewing comes in. A lot of different techniques that we can use with regard to that. I do a lot of motivational interviewing training. And if you're interested in learning more about motivational interviewing in the context of how you work with people with psychiatric disabilities, reach out to me and we can have a conversation about that. The latest edition of motivational interviewing was put out earlier, I'm sorry, in 23, I believe. And that is the fourth edition. It is quite good, by Miller and Rolnick. Cognitive behavioral interventions. I mentioned Sang's research around putting some cognitive interventions in schizophrenia really tends to improve outcomes, especially in work. And then additional empowerment strategies. That has to do with shared decision making and collaboration and a lot of the principles that we've talked about so far. So fundamentally, what works? Collaboration with the client, and again, these links are to the studies that echo that. If you're interested, shared decision making, client driven decision making, community engagement, and employment. We know employment works. Interestingly enough, and I've kind of included this at the bottom. It's in a little smaller font. Higher neuropsychological function tends to predict work outcomes among people with severe and persistent mental illnesses. So there's an argument there for helping people to really think things through, helping people to clarify how they're thinking about things tends to enhance, tends to improve not only work outcomes, but overall functioning as well. And then rapid placement and client choice, kind of going back to that IPS idea. So I'll wrap it up here, and then I want to have a little bit of time for questions. In professional development, this is how we define how prepared we are, right? What knowledge do we have? You have a little more knowledge now. Maybe you knew all this stuff already, and that's cool if you did. But you have other things that you can read and go deeper. You have the skills. You've been trained for this. You guys are well-trained professionals. Here's the attitudes. You already own the piece of equipment that's going to help you to identify how effective you can be in psychiatric rehabilitation. I promise you that you have one, and here's your exercise. I want you to go to your house, your home, find your bathroom, gaze into that bathroom mirror, and ask yourself, that's the piece of equipment. What do I believe? What do I believe about people's potential to be successful? Depending on how and answer that question honestly. Depending on how you answer that question, that'll dictate where you need to go. That'll dictate what you need to dig into. So there you go. That's an overview of best practices and recovery-based practices for professionals. I'm happy to answer any questions. I think we have about, 6 or 7 minutes for that.
And so everybody feel free to put questions in the chat. I saw there was, excuse me, a couple comments from Jennifer earlier. I'm trying to find them in here, but I had a question form in my brain based on those that I hope it's okay if I ask, which is, Jennifer was commenting on how she's found it difficult to get some people and even organizations who've been in the employment field for a long time to have open minds about this and seeming to be kind of stuck. Can you speak to ways to help with that and foster open-mindedness?
Absolutely. I've run into the same thing. I was a counselor at vocational rehabilitation. And again, to South Carolina's credit, they've been pretty advanced. But there's been a lot of pushback. I've done a lot of trainings on work as an intervention. And I'll tell you, the one place that I've gotten traction with regard to that is, hey, these kinds of interventions actually will enhance your outcomes. So if you're, talk about like you dyed in the wool, voc rehab person, I got to get my 26s, I got to make my numbers. If I can say to somebody, you'll make your numbers much more efficiently with this population if you're using these principles and these techniques, and they start to have some success, that's the best. That tends to get the best buy-in. The other part of it is, think about it. If you're having that conversation with somebody, thinking about it from your own perspective. What would work best for me? Would it work best for me if everybody did everything for me and then told me where to go and where to be? Or would it work best if I came to these conclusions and I found something I was passionate about and I was engaged with? So that the other strategy is to kind of turn the mirror around and say, look, us is them, them or us. What about these principles wouldn't you want to have in services? Which one would you leave by the curb for services for you? And that's a harder thing, and when people really start to look at that, if your brother, sister, cousin, father were in services, which one of these would you want me to leave at home? That's another really powerful way to present that question.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm just checking the chat, see if there's any more questions in there.
Dan, thank you for that question. It was excellent.
There's we have Amber ask, can you please describe a little further or give us an example of increasing neuropsychological functioning?
Yeah, absolutely. So I won't tell a story about it. It'll take too long. But one of the things that I've done with particular clients is let's talk about like the thought process behind some of the emotional reactions that you've come up with, right? So I'm working with a client who's really reactive, emotionally reactive. We start to talk about being more intentional, right? And a little less emotionally explosive. And so how can we take this from an emotionally reactive situation to something we can think through? So let's practice some thought processes that we can go through. So one of my favorite, let me say this, top-down interventions that have to move from the prefrontal cortex down into where all of our reactivity stands with in the amygdala in our brain. It takes 2.8 microseconds for that intervention to get there. If we take a bottom-up approach, it takes 1.2 microseconds. So the first thing I'm going to do to work with that person who's really reactive is I'm going to teach them some bottom up skills. First thing I want you to do when you're in that situation, count to 10, breathe, right? Because it's a very bottom up. Breath is a very bottom up thing. You can't not, once you concentrate on your breathing, you really can't do anything else. The brain is a neuropsychological unitasker. Like to think it's a multitasker, but it isn't. It's a unitasker. So if the person's focused on their breathing and what they can see around them, you've seen those grounding exercises. Name 5 things you can see and 4 things you can touch, and that's unitasking in the brain. It takes the reactivity from the amygdala, which produces a lot of that, to the motor cortex, and it puts it up into the prefrontal cortex where somebody's thinking about different things. It's focusing on a bottom up, breathing, presence-based activity. Then you can fire the prefrontal cortex up and say, let's think it through. How would you want to intentionally respond? So when that happens, I want you to take a breath, focus on your breathing, count to 10, and while you're counting to 10, let's think about what you can think about. How do I want to respond? What's a good way to connect? Is this going to be productive with connection? Does this leverage a strength that I have? Those bottom up interventions and thinking through cognitively. I'm sorry, I know that was a super quick answer. Was that helpful?
It's helpful to me, and I would imagine we can see if Amber pops anything in the chat too, but that makes complete sense. And I can see, yes, Amber says yes, exclamation point. So that would be a yes, a definite yes on that one.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more about that bottom up stuff, Jennifer Sweeten is a trainer out there. She does some amazing work around therapy. It's called right out of my head it went. But anyway, it's a certification for neuro-informed therapy, neuropsychotherapy. There is what I was looking for. She's amazing. She's a great trainer, and she's really knows her stuff. She's certified in EMDR too, if you're interested in going down that road. But I find that a lot of that stuff, independent of outside of therapy, really works.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Walsh. I have more questions as well, but I know we're at the end of time, so I'll just be mindful of
Apologize.
that.
I went as fast as I could. It was a
You
lot of
did great. Yeah, no problem on that. I think we got a lot of really, really good information. This was super helpful. So thank you. And we would like to provide our sincerest gratitude to Dr. Walsh for this wonderful presentation today on psychiatric rehabilitation, best practices and recovery services for rehabilitation professionals. Dr. Walsh, we're very grateful for your work, your contributions, your advocacy, and taking time to share with us today. So thank you on that.
Happy to do it.
And then for those in attendance, we appreciate you joining us today, and we'd like to invite you to save the date for our next ARCA webinar, which is on, let's see here, June 19th from 12 to 1 Eastern Time. And it's titled The Dialectical Supervisor, Utilizing Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, DBT, and the Discrimination Model as a Clinical Intervention. So
There you go. That's how you do it.
there you go. Yeah, a good transition, actually, a good next step. And don't forget to have signed in, fill out the evaluation, and then it's a registration link for our next webinar can be found in the chat box. And we hope you'll consider joining us. And thank you all again so much. And I hope you have a good weekend.